The summer of 1878 hung heavy over the town of Dry Creek, the kind of dry, sweltering heat that made even the wooden storefronts look thirsty. Dust rolled across the single street whenever a wagon creaked past, and the saloon doors, with their cracked paint, seemed to groan louder than usual each time they swung. Inside the general store, however, the air was heavier still, not because of the heat, but because of the words being spoken. 17-year-old Clara sat stiffly on a stool behind the counter, her hands folded in her lap, though she could hardly keep them from trembling. She had been told to stay quiet, to let her father do the talking. He hadn't looked her in the eye all morning, and that told her everything she needed to know. Her father, Henry Talbot, had once been a man of fair reputation, a farmer, proud of his work, proud of his land. But land had a way of turning against a man in this part of the world. First it had been the drought, then a swarm of locusts, then the endless cycle of loans he couldn't repay. By now he was hollowed out, his face sunken from too many sleepless nights and too much whiskey. Across from him stood Koa, the Apache. Tall, broad-shouldered, his hair bound back in a leather thong, he looked like a figure carved from the very rock of the mesas. He was not a stranger in Dry Creek. People eyed him whenever he came to town, but no one dared confront him. He carried himself with a calm stillness that unsettled the nervous and silenced the bold. "You'll keep her fed, clothed," Henry said, clearing his throat, unable to hide the quaver in his voice. "That's all I ask. She's strong enough, knows how to cook clean, work hard. You won't find her lazy." Clara's stomach lurched. The words cut deep, like she was a mule being appraised. She wanted to scream, to plead, but fear held her tongue. She had overheard enough the night before, when her father thought her asleep. The debt collectors had been circling. They'd strip the farm bare, leave them destitute. Unless, of course, Henry found another way. Her other way now stood before her. Koa said nothing for a long moment. His dark eyes flicked toward Clara, not with hunger, not even with ownership, but with an unreadable weight that made her shiver. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, even. "She comes with me. She learns my ways. After that, she is not yours anymore." The finality of it sent Clara's world spinning. Not yours anymore. As though she were nothing more than a calf changing brands. Henry rubbed a hand over his mouth, then nodded quickly. Yes, I understand. Better life than what I can give her. I thank you for it." Clara couldn't stay silent anymore. "Papa," the word tore out of her, raw, desperate. He flinched but wouldn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the floorboards, as if by not meeting her gaze he could silence his conscience. "This is not right," she whispered, her throat tight. "You can't, girl," Henry snapped, his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it. "You hush now. You hush." He turned to Koa as if afraid the man might change his mind. "She do as you say? She mind herself." Koa remained still, his expression unreadable. He gave a single, curt nod. Then, to Clara's astonishment, he spoke directly to her. "You come with me. No chains. No rope. You walk on your own." Her breath caught. The room seemed to shrink around her. She searched for some trace of mercy in her father's face, but found none. She looked at Koa, and though fear burned inside her, she saw something she hadn't expected. Not cruelty, not triumph, but a kind of loneliness. A vast, aching solitude that matched her own in a way that unsettled her more than anger might have. The deal was done. A pouch of coins clinked against the counter, her worth reduced to metal. Henry grabbed it quickly, as though afraid the Apache would reconsider. Clara rose from the stool, her knees weak, her throat thick with the cry she would not allow herself to make. She knew that stepping outside meant the end of her childhood, the end of all she had known. Yet her feet carried her to the door. The sun outside was blinding, harsh. Koa walked ahead, his long stride steady, and she followed, her shadow stretching behind her like a tether to the life she was leaving. She did not know what awaited her in the wilderness, or if she would survive it. But she knew this much. No one in Dry Creek would expect her story to end the way it would. The heat of the afternoon wrapped itself around Clara like a suffocating cloak as she stepped onto the street of Dry Creek. Behind her, the creaking doors of the general store swung shut. And with that sound came the brutal realization there was no turning back. Her father remained inside, clutching the coins as if they were salvation, though they had cost him something no gold could ever repay. Clara's heart hammered as she followed the tall figure ahead of her. Koa didn't look back to see if she trailed him, didn't speak, didn't even slow his stride. His presence alone seemed enough to part the street. Townsfolk, lingering near storefronts or lounging on porches, fell silent as he passed. They watched with narrowed eyes, their whispers carried on the wind, but none dared approach. Clara kept her gaze fixed on the ground, the weight of their stares pressing against her like stones. Shame burned her cheeks, though she knew she had done nothing wrong. Still, it felt as though she wore a mark visible to everyone, that of a girl sold off like chattel dot at the edge of town. A horse waited, tethered beneath the brittle shade of a mesquite tree. It was a strong beast, dark-coated and restless, stamping at the dust. Beside it, 2 saddlebags bulged with supplies. Clara's throat tightened. This wasn't just a trip. This was a departure into another life entirely. Koa untied the reins and mounted fluidly, every movement silent and sure, like he was carved out of the landscape itself. Only then did he glance back at Clara. He extended one hand toward her, not in command, but in expectation. For a moment she froze, the urge to run surging within her. She thought of bolting back down the road, begging the sheriff for help, screaming at her father until his heart cracked open with regret. But even as the thoughts flared, she knew the truth. No one would interfere. Not for her. Not against him. With trembling fingers, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, steady, not cruel. He pulled her up behind him, and before she could gather her bearings, the horse lurched forward. The town fell away behind them. Dry Creek, with its sagging porches and dusty saloon, shrank into a blur, swallowed by the desert. Clara twisted once in the saddle to glance back. She thought she might see her father standing in the doorway, watching after her. But the street was empty. He hadn't even come outside. Her chest tightened painfully. That was the last glimpse she would have of him, not as the father who once lifted her onto his shoulders to reach the apple tree, but as the man who had bartered her life for coins. The desert spread out before them, vast and merciless. Sunlight blazed against the red cliffs in the distance. The air shimmered with heat, and the only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves pounding the earth. Hours passed without words. Clara's legs ached from gripping the saddle, and her throat was parched, but she refused to ask for water. She clung to silence as stubbornly as she clung to the horse, afraid that if she spoke, she might betray the storm roiling inside her at last. As twilight began to paint the sky in violet and gold, Koa slowed the horse and dismounted. He offered her a hand again, and though she wanted to slap it away, she took it, too weary to risk falling. He handed her a canteen, tilting it toward her without a word. She hesitated, meeting his gaze in the dim light. His eyes were unreadable, deep as shadow. Yet there was no gloating there, no cruelty. Just quiet expectation. Clara drank, the cool water startling against her dry tongue. When she passed it back, he nodded once, as if satisfied. They made camp beneath a rocky overhang. Koa gathered wood and sparked a small fire. Clara sat stiffly across from him, hugging her knees, watching the flames flicker. Fear still gnawed at her, but curiosity crept in alongside it. Why had he said no chains, no rope? Why treat her like she had a choice when clearly she did not? The silence between them stretched. Finally, Koa spoke, his voice low, carrying the weight of certainty. "You are not a prisoner," he said, "but you are not free to return. Your path is with me now." Clara stared at him, her heart pounding. She wanted to spit back words of defiance, to claim she would never belong to him. But something in his tone, something uncheckable, like the stone cliffs looming above, held her tongue taut as the stars spilled across the desert sky. Clara lay awake on her bedroll, listening to the fire crackle and the steady breathing of the man beside her. She realized with cold clarity that her old life had ended the moment she stepped out of Dry Creek. Whatever came next, she would face it in the wilderness beside the man she both feared and could not yet understand. Morning came sharp and merciless. The desert did not believe in gentle awakenings. Clara stirred on her rough bedroll, the stone beneath her back pressing hard into her bones. When she opened her eyes, the sun was already spilling over the horizon, its light searing gold against the rocks. Koa was awake, crouched by the fire pit, grinding something between two stones. His movements were silent, efficient, like every gesture had a purpose. The embers smoked faintly, but he had already doused the fire, leaving little trace. It struck Clara he lived like a shadow, making himself part of the land, not an intruder upon it. "You rise," he said, not glancing at her. It was not a question that Clara pushed herself upright, her muscles aching from the ride, from the night on hard earth. She wanted to snap at him, to declare she would rise when she pleased, but exhaustion weighed down her tongue. She smoothed her tangled hair with trembling hands. Aware of how small and out of place she looked against the wild sweep of desert, Koa handed her a strip of dried meat. "Eat." Her stomach clenched at the sight of it, tough, salt-cured. A far cry from the stews she used to help her mother cook before illness had carried her away. But hunger overcame pride. She bit down, chewing until her jaw ached, forcing herself to swallow. When they set off again, Clara found herself watching him with wary eyes. He rode with the ease of someone born to the saddle, back straight, gaze fixed on the horizon. She clutched the saddle horn behind him, trying not to sway. The land stretched out in every direction, red earth, broken mesas, the occasional dry stream snaking through the emptiness. Each mile carried her further from the world she knew. Deeper into his dot by midday, they reached a narrow canyon where a trickle of water still ran, guarded by cottonwoods. Here, Koa dismounted and began teaching her without asking if she wished to learn. "Fill this." He handed her a skin bladder. Clara stared at the shallow stream, the mud thick beneath the surface, and knelt to do as he said. When she returned, her dress streaked brown, he inspected her work, then gestured again. Not enough, again. The next hours bled into each other with the rhythm of labor. He showed her how to gather dry brush for fire, how to strip cactus fruit without cutting her fingers, how to grind corn with stone until it yielded a coarse meal. Every task was necessary, every task relentless. Her hands blistered, her shoulders burned. Once, when she faltered, she dropped a bundle of sticks and frustration burst from her lips. "I'm not your servant," she snapped. Koa turned, his gaze sharp but steady. For a heartbeat, she expected anger. Instead, he simply said, "Not servant, survivor. You want to live, you work." The words stung. She wanted to spit them back at him, to say she hadn't chosen this life, hadn't asked to be taken here. Yet deep down, beneath the anger, a cold truth settled in her chest. He was right. If she did nothing, the desert would swallow her whole. That night, Clara's hands throbbed as she sat by the fire. Koa offered her a small paste of herbs, gesturing for her to spread it across her palms. The cool sting soothed her blisters. She muttered a quiet thanks, surprised to hear herself say it. Koa gave no reply, only fed another branch to the flames. Days blurred into one another. She learned to haul water without spilling, to gather wood without complaint, to coax sparks into fire. Each morning she rose weary, but each night she fell asleep with a new skill embedded in her bones. The harshness of the land forced her forward, and Koa, unyielding and silent, was both her taskmaster and her guide, but it was not kindness that bound them. Not yet. She still feared him, his silence, his strength, his inscrutable eyes. And though he never raised a hand against her, never treated her cruelly, she felt the invisible walls of her cage. She was no longer Clara Talbot of Dry Creek. She was a stranger in a wild land, reshaped by hunger, by labor, by necessity. And as the stars wheeled overhead, she wondered if the girl she had been would ever return, or if she was being carved into something new, something neither of them had yet named. The desert had begun to seep into Clara's bones. Days bled together: sunrise, toil, dusk, exhaustion. Each morning she rose before the heat became unbearable. Each night she collapsed beside the fire, her body aching in places she hadn't known could ache. Yet somewhere in the endless rhythm of survival, small things began to change. It started with the blanket. That night had been bitter, the wind cutting through her thin dress until she shivered so violently her teeth ached. She had pulled her knees tight against her chest, fighting sleep, unwilling to beg for warmth. When morning light finally crept across the camp, she woke to find an extra blanket draped over her shoulders, coarse but thick. Koa was already up, sharpening his knife, saying nothing. But he had placed it there. The next kindness came when fever struck. The sun had been merciless that day, and Clara, unused to the work and the heat, staggered as she tried to carry a load of kindling. She collapsed to her knees, the world spinning, her skin blazing. Before she could protest, Koa was beside her. He pressed a skin of water into her hands, steadying her as she drank. Later, when chills racked her body, he returned from the hills with a pouch of crushed leaves. He boiled them into a bitter tea and held it out. She wrinkled her nose. "It tastes foul." His mouth twitched. Was it amusement? Before he said simply, "Drink." She did, gagging on the bitterness, but by morning the fever had broken. She woke weak but alive, and Koa had left food beside her bedroll jerky and ground corn. He did not speak of it, did not wait for thanks. He moved on with his usual silence, as though his actions were nothing more than necessity. Clara's fear of him did not vanish, but it shifted. She began to see that his sternness was not cruelty. He watched her as one watches a storm on the horizon, cautious, expectant, but never unkind. One evening, after weeks had passed, Clara crouched by the fire, clumsy fingers trying to clean a fish Koa had caught. She tore the flesh wrong, wasting half of it, and let out a sharp breath of frustration. "You laugh at me, I know it," she muttered under her breath. Cheeks flushed. Across the fire, Koa shook his head. No laugh. He reached for the knife, showing her with slow, precise motions how to slit the belly, how to scrape the bones clean. Then he handed it back, waiting for her to try. Her hand still fumbled, but the cut was straighter this time. She glanced up at him, expecting a scowl. Instead, he nodded once. A silent approval. The small gesture warmed her more than the fire. Clara began to notice other details. When she walked too far from camp, he always seemed to appear on some ridge nearby, watching. When she stumbled, he slowed his pace until she caught up, though he never acknowledged it aloud. Once, when her shoe tore against sharp rock, she thought she would have to hobble in pain for days. That night, Koa set down a pair of soft leather moccasins by her blanket. He didn't hand them to her, didn't say a word, but when she slid them on, they fit as though made for her. The realization unsettled her. He was paying attention, for Clara. Kindness had always come wrapped in words, her mother's gentle encouragement, the hymns sung softly at church. Koa's was different. His language was silence, his gestures rough-hewn but steady. She could not say she trusted him, not yet, but each small act chipped away at the fear. One night, as coyotes yipped in the distance and sparks drifted skyward from the fire, Clara lay awake, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. For the first time since leaving Dry Creek, she did not feel entirely alone. It frightened her more than the wilderness ever could. Because what did it mean, this strange comfort? She had been sold, taken into the hands of a man she'd feared would break her. Yet now she found herself depending on him not just for survival, but for something deeper she could not yet name. She turned her face into the blanket, whispering a prayer she wasn't sure she believed anymore. She prayed for strength, for escape, for clarity. But above all, she prayed she would not lose herself in the quiet gravity of the man across the fire. The desert had a way of measuring time differently. Clara no longer counted days the way she had in Dry Creek, with bells tolling from the church and shopkeepers calling out closing hours. Out here, life was measured in sunrises and sunsets, in how long the firewood lasted, in how many steps it took to reach the next water source. Weeks had passed since she had first followed Koa into the wilderness. She was no longer the trembling girl clinging to the back of his horse, though fear still shadowed her. Her body bore calluses now. Her shoulders had grown stronger. Yet in her mind questions still gnawed. Why had he taken her? Why had he agreed to such a bargain? One night, as the moon rose pale over the mesas, Clara found her voice. They had eaten little, just roasted rabbit and cactus fruit, and now the fire burned low between them. Clara sat cross-legged, fingers worrying at the frayed hem of her skirt. Koa, as always, sat in stillness, sharpening his blade with slow, even strokes. She could not bear the silence any longer. "Why me?" she asked suddenly. Her voice cracked against the night. Koa didn't look up, but the scraping of stone against steel ceased. He set the knife aside, resting his elbows on his knees. For a long moment, he said nothing. Clara's pulse thudded in her ears. At last he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Not for wife, not for servant, for freedom." Her brows knit. "Freedom? That makes no sense. You paid my father for me." Koa's gaze flicked to the fire. "I paid to take you away, to keep you from men who would not give you choice, who would break you." Clara stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. "You mean my father would have sold me to someone else?" His jaw tightened. "I heard it. In town? 2 men spoke in the saloon. They planned to take you. Not for coin. Not for marriage. For worse." The words turned her blood cold. She drew the blanket tighter around herself, nausea rising. She had known her father was desperate, that his debts had driven him to betray her, but the thought of being thrown into the hands of strangers, men who meant her harm, made her shudder violently. "You stopped it?" she whispered. Koa inclined his head once. "Yes." Clara's throat closed. Gratitude and anger battled within her. Gratitude that he had spared her a darker fate, anger that her life had been reduced to bargaining at all. She stared into the flames, trying to steady her breathing. "Why?" she pressed. "Why care what happens to me? You don't even know me." For the first time since she had met him, Koa's expression shifted, softened. His voice, when it came, carried a rough edge of memory. "Because once I was traded," he said. "Taken from my people when I was a boy. Sold between white men like horse or rifle. No choice, no voice. I know what it is." Clara's eyes widened. In his silence, she had never imagined such a past. He had always seemed unbreakable, carved from stone. But now she glimpsed the fracture lines beneath lines that matched her own. "And so," he continued, I will not let it happen again if I can stop it." The fire popped, sending sparks into the night. Clara blinked against the sting in her eyes. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to apologize for all the hatred she had carried in her heart. But her voice failed her. Koa reached for his blade again, resuming the slow rhythm of sharpening. It was as though he had said too much already. Yet the silence between them had changed. It was no longer a wall but a bridge, fragile but real. Clara lay down on her blanket, her body curling toward the fire. But she could not sleep. His words turned circles in her mind, unsettling and comforting all at once. For the first time, she realized Koa had not taken her as a man claims property. He had taken her to spare her, to protect her, even if she had not asked for it. The revelation both eased and burdened her heart, because if he was not her captor, then what was he? And, more frightening still, what was she becoming to him? The days after Koa's confession unfolded differently. Clara could not look at him the same way. She still feared his silence, still resented the life she had been thrust into. But now, beneath that, a current of something else stirred, something softer, something dangerous. She began to notice details she had overlooked before. The way he rose with the dawn, not out of restlessness but to scout their surroundings, making sure she was safe. The way his hands, so calloused from work, handled even fragile things with care. A pot balanced on coals, a feather he used to fletch an arrow, and, most surprising of all, the way he listened out one evening. As the sky burned crimson and gold, Clara found herself speaking without meaning to. She told him about her mother's songs hymns sung low in the kitchen while kneading bread. She described the orchard where she had once hidden during childhood games, and how, after her mother's death, the house had grown unbearably quiet. Koa didn't interrupt. He didn't offer sympathy the way other men might, with clumsy words and awkward hands. He simply listened, his eyes steady on her, his silence holding space for her voice. When she faltered, he said softly, "She gave you songs. They live in you still." It was the closest thing to comfort she had heard in years. In turn, he spoke sparingly of his own past, never more than a few sentences, but each carried the weight of memory. He told her of the canyon where his people once gathered, of hunting trips with his brothers, of a mother's laughter now lost to time. He said little of the suffering, though Clara could see it in the shadows that sometimes crossed his face when the firelight flickered just so. Through these fragments, something shifted. He was no longer only the stern Apache who had taken her from Dry Creek. He was a man shaped by grief, by resilience, by choices that had cost him much. Clara felt her heart betraying her. She caught herself watching him too long, tracing the lines of his face in the firelight, the steady set of his jaw, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him. When he moved through camp, she found herself matching his rhythm unconsciously, her steps falling into his pattern. At night, lying beneath the endless sky, she thought of the future not as an escape back to Dry Creek, but as a path unfolding beside him. The thought terrified her, and yet it would not leave her. One afternoon, while gathering water, Clara slipped on the stones near the stream and gashed her palm. Blood welled quickly, stinging bright against her skin. She hissed in pain. Koa was at her side in an instant. He took her hand firmly but gently, tearing a strip of cloth from his own tunic to wrap the wound. His touch was careful, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You must take care," he murmured, his voice low. Her throat tightened. The words were simple, but the way he said them, gentle, almost tender, stirred something fierce inside her. She swallowed hard, blinking against the tears she would not let fall. When their eyes met, the air between them seemed to thicken. For a moment, neither moved. Clara felt the rapid beat of her own heart and wondered if he could hear it. But Koa released her hand, tying the bandage securely before stepping back. The moment passed, though its echo lingered. That night, Clara could not sleep. She turned over on her bedroll, staring at the stars. Her mind replayed the warmth of his hand against hers, the steadiness of his voice. She had been sold. She had been taken. And yet, against all reason, against all propriety, she was beginning to want what she had once feared most. To remain by his side. The realization frightened her more than anything that had come before. Because if she gave her heart to him, it would no longer be a matter of survival. It would be a choice no one had forced upon her, and that, she realized, was freedom of a different kind. The desert did not always keep its silence. Sometimes it erupted with violence. It happened just after dawn, when the air was still cool and pale mist curled along the ridges. Clara was bent over the fire, coaxing embers to life, when she heard the first sound, the distant thud of hooves. At first, she thought it was Koa returning from a scouting trip, but the sound grew heavier, multiplied too many hooves. Too much weight. Her heart froze. Koa appeared suddenly at the edge of camp, bow in hand, his expression sharper than she had ever seen. "Raiders," he said, voice low but urgent. "Pack nothing. Stay close." Before she could respond, they descended. A half-dozen men on horseback, faces masked with scarves, rifles glinting in the rising sun. They swept into the canyon like wolves, shouting in a language Clara half understood. Koa loosed an arrow before the first man even dismounted. The raider toppled from his saddle with a cry, but the others surged forward, firing shots that splintered stone and sent sparks from the fire. Clara ducked instinctively, her breath coming ragged. Fear surged like a tide, fear that froze her legs, choked her throat. She had been taken from one life into another, and now it seemed this life might end in blood. Koa stood his ground, fierce and unyielding, bow in one hand, knife in the other. But he was outnumbered. One raider circled wide, charging toward Clara. Something broke loose inside her. Weeks of grinding work, of lessons hammered into her bones, surged back all at once. She remembered Koa's steady voice teaching her how to strike flint, how to cut fish, how to hold a blade. Not as chores. As survival. Her hand shot to the knife at her belt, the one Koa had given her days before. As the rider lunged, she slashed at the horse's flank, forcing it to rear. The man tumbled, cursing. Clara scrambled forward, adrenaline drowning out fear, and pressed the knife to his throat before he could rise. Her hand shook violently, but she did not falter. The raider froze, staring up at her with wide eyes. Clara's chest heaved. She had never held a weapon against another soul in her life, yet now she stood between life and death, and she chose not to yield. Across the clearing, Koa dispatched another attacker with brutal precision. When his gaze flicked toward her, his eyes widened not in disapproval, but in fierce recognition. She was no longer the helpless girl he had led from Dry Creek. The fight ended as suddenly as it began. 2 raiders lay dead, the rest fleeing into the canyon, their shouts echoing until the desert swallowed them whole. Clara's knife hand trembled uncontrollably as the man beneath her scrambled away, clutching his wounded pride more tightly than his weapon. She dropped the blade, sinking to her knees, her body shaking with the aftershock of violence. Koa was at her side instantly. His hand gripped her shoulder, grounding her. She expected him to scold her recklessness, to remind her of her place. Instead, he said only, "You chose to stand." Tears burned her eyes, hot and unrelenting. I didn't know if I could," she whispered. "You did." His voice was steady, certain. "You stood." For the first time since leaving Dry Creek, Clara felt something solid within herself. Not just survival, not just endurance, strength. She had fought not because he commanded it, not because she was forced, but because she chose it. As the sun rose higher, painting the canyon walls in fire and gold, Clara wiped the blood from her hands. She met Koa's gaze, and for once she did not look away. The fear that had bound her for so long loosened its grip. In its place was something new: respect, trust, and beneath it all, the first stirrings of devotion she could no longer deny. The raiders had come to break them. Instead, they had forged something unbreakable. The desert was quiet again. Too quiet, Clara thought, after the chaos of gunfire and shouting. Only the wind remained, carrying the scent of smoke and blood away with the dawn. She sat beside the dying fire, her knife lying in the dust. Her hand still shook faintly, though the fear that had once consumed her was gone. In its place was a strange steadiness, as though something deep inside had shifted permanently. Koa stood nearby, scanning the ridges for any sign of returning raiders. When he was satisfied the danger had passed, he returned to her, crouching low so his eyes met hers. "You did well," he said simply. Clara's throat tightened. "I was terrified." "Fear makes the heart honest," he replied. "But you did not run. You stayed." She looked at him then, really looked. His face was streaked with sweat and dust, his tunic torn at the shoulder. He looked every inch the warrior, unyielding, formidable. Yet beneath it, she saw what few others would have, a man who had chosen again and again to protect rather than destroy. The words slipped out before she could stop them. "I thought you were my captor, but you've been my savior." For a heartbeat, silence hung heavy between them. Koa's gaze softened, and when he spoke, his voice carried something rare, something almost fragile. "I am not savior," he said. "I only walked beside you. The strength was yours to find." Clara blinked hard, fighting tears. She thought of her father's hand exchanging her life for coins, of the girl who had left Dry Creek trembling and broken. That girl felt like a ghost now. The woman sitting here had blood on her hands, yes, but also fire in her chest. She had fought. She had chosen. She had survived. The days that followed were quieter, though the memory of the raid lingered in every glance they shared. Something unspoken stretched between them now, not fear, not obligation, but something far deeper. One evening, as they camped beside a shallow river, Clara found herself singing softly, almost without realizing it, a hymn her mother used to hum in the orchard. The melody floated fragile and clear across the water. When she stopped, embarrassed, Koa said, "Your mother's song." Clara nodded. "She always said songs keep you from forgetting who you are." "You remember," Koa said, watching her intently. "But you are not the same as before." "No," Clara admitted, her voice trembling. "I don't think I ever will be again." Koa reached into his pouch, pulling out a small carved figure of wood. An eagle, wings spread wide. He placed it in her palm. "For you," he said. She traced its rough edges, her chest aching. "Why?" "Eagle flies free," he said. "You are not bound." "Not to me, not to anyone." "You stay if you choose. You leave if you choose. Your path is your own." Clara's breath caught. Freedom, the one thing she thought had been stripped from her, was being handed back. Not by her father, not by the men who had sought to take her, but by the one she had thought her captor. Slowly, she closed her fingers around the eagle. "I choose to stay," she whispered. Koa studied her for a long moment, then gave a single, solemn nod. He did not smile, but his eyes glimmered in the firelight, brighter than she had ever seen them. That night, beneath the wide sky and its scatter of stars, Clara lay beside him. No chains bound her, no bargains weighed upon her. She was not the girl who had been sold. She was a woman who had walked through fire and come out remade, who had chosen her own fate with clear eyes. No one in Dry Creek would have expected such an ending. Not her father, not the gossiping townsfolk, not the man who had once eyed her like prey. She had not been broken. She had not been lost. Instead, she had found love in the most unlikely of places, not born of possession, but of respect, of trust, of shared survival. And when she closed her eyes, listening to the river's steady song, she knew her story had only just begun.